Fusing news reporting with investigative journalism with talk radio. Now back to Aaron Klein, Investigative Radio.
The phone number here is 877-970-2999. Taking more questions and comments shortly. Right now, I want to go to the guest line, and I want to turn to North Korea. Totally unhinged, and we have to pay very careful attention to the threats coming from North Korea because they're being minimized in a massive way by the news media. On Friday now, North Korea now accuses the United States and also, of course, South Korea of unsuccessful assassination attempt on Kim Jong-un. This time he claims involving biological weapons. North Korea's Ministry of State Security said that it will, quote, ferret out and mercilessly destroy the terrorists, quote unquote, in the CIA and in the South Korean intelligence agencies. And this after multiple threats by North Korea against the Trump administration and also against the United States Homefront. And I want to go immediately to the U.S. Homefront and the threats from North Korea because the media is not fully outlining what they are. So I want to do that right now with Peter Vincent Pry, who is the executive director, and this is very important, chief of staff, in fact, of the Congressional EMP Commission. He's also the executive director of the Congressional Task Force on National and Homeland Security. Peter Vincent Pry, Dr. Pry, welcome back to Aaron Klein Investigative Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. So I want to get immediately to this Newsmax piece that you wrote because it's excellent, and you outlined how the media, you even cited a very recent example, is minimizing in a massive way, and this is very dangerous, the not just the missile threat, not just the nuclear threat, but I want to turn to the EMP threat, which they seem to be missing altogether. In fact, you write, quote, speculation is accepted as gospel that North Korea allegedly does not have a re-entry vehicle capable of penetrating the atmosphere. They allegedly lack guidance systems accurate enough to strike a military target or at intercontinental ranges, even a city. So putting aside the missile threat, which we addressed many times here on this radio show, and the media, again, is minimizing, you don't even need a re-entry for an EMP attack, correct?
That's right, because the warhead would be detonated above the atmosphere, exo-atmospherically, so you don't have to penetrate the atmosphere and re-enter to strike a city.
So then, therefore, when the media here talks, and we talk also about the missile threat, of course, and of the nuclear threat, something that Iran, we can learn a lot from when it comes to the nuclear deal with Iran. Let's look, how specific is the EMP threat from North Korea? Do you believe there's evidence that they have been preparing for just that? While we're sitting there focusing on the nuclear threat, which we should, on the missile threat, it's all interconnected, has North Korea over the years been preparing, been testing for a possible EMP attack?
Well, the EMP Commission certainly believes so. And we've got the lead in the U.S. government. Our charter from Congress, basically is to advise Congress, the President, the Department of Defense. We have our powers are such that we can get any classified and unclassified information we need, and we can task analysis upon these departments and agencies. So we have extraordinary powers to get at the truth about what's really happening. And yet nobody in the mainstream media seems to want to talk to us. Instead, they would prefer to talk to people who have no expertise at all on this subject, people like Jeffrey Lewis in 38 North, for example, as I mentioned in the article. And there's compelling evidence that the North Koreans know about the nuclear EMP attack. It's part of the nuclear threat. You'd use a nuclear weapon, to detonate above the atmosphere. Although there are also non-nuclear EMP weapons, which North Korea has also actually used against South Korea. It's one of the most astonishing things, too, that critics seem to be unaware of. That North Korea actually has conducted non-nuclear EMP attacks against South Korea in 2010, 2011, and 2012. They have a radio frequency cannon, so-called, puts out basically non-nuclear EMPs, like microwave radiation, and they used it in those 3 years to impose an electromagnetic blockade on Seoul. They were threatening airliners, with it, because the electronics and airliners and their global positioning systems are put at risk by this thing. And for some days, they managed to block all air traffic from going into Seoul. And some of the other consequences during these 3 years when North Korea made these non-nuclear EMP attacks against South Korea is it caused automobiles so they couldn't start, radio stations were blacked out all along in Seoul and in towns and cities near the demilitarized zone within range of this. So we know for a fact that the North Koreans know about EMP-type weapons and had actually used them for 3 years in the past. The commission was demarched in a highly unusual effort by 2 Russian generals who claimed they were there on their own. But Russian generals never do a démarche without the permission of Moscow. And in 2004, they met with the EMP Commission, asked to meet with us, and warned us that the design information for Russia's super EMP nuclear warhead had allegedly been accidentally transferred to North Korea, and that, moreover, due to brain drain from Russian scientists, that there were Russian and Chinese scientists in North Korea helping North Korea work on developing a super EMP weapon.
Yeah, I mean, you point out, and this was April 30th, where South Korean officials told the Korean Times there, this was after the media told us also that there was a test on April 29th. There was a medium-range missile that the media told us was a failure, but South Korea actually is pointing out that it was detonated deliberately at 72 kilometers altitude, which actually happens to be pretty much the optimum burst height, you write, for an EMP attack. So we're speaking with Dr. Peter Pry, who's the Chief of Staff of the Congressional EMP Commission, and I'm very glad that you're now in this critical position. How would you advise right now Donald Trump to address this obviously unaddressed, largely, issue when it comes to North Korea and EMP?
Well, the first thing I'd recommend to the president is to shoot down the 2 North Korean satellites that are currently orbiting over our country on trajectories that are optimized for making a surprise EMP attack. We've got 2 North Korean satellites that are in permanent orbit. One was launched in 2012. The other was launched in last year. I believe it was February 7th. They're called the KMS-3 and the KMS-4. And they're on south polar trajectories. This is another possible gift from our Russian friends. During the Cold War, the Russians had a secret weapon they called the fractional orbital bombardment system. And the idea was to do a surprise EMP attack against the United States by disguising a warhead as a satellite. And because a satellite trajectory is different from an ICBM trajectory that's aimed to go at a city. For accuracy on an ICBM, you launch it on a lower energy 45-degree angle, and it follows a classic ballistic trajectory like a rifle bullet, to land your missile on a city. But to put a satellite in orbit, you follow a different trajectory. It doesn't have accuracy, but it puts the satellite up there so that it can stay in permanent orbit. So it looks different in terms of the trajectory. And guys watching their radar screens tend not to get alarmed when they see a missile being launched on that satellite trajectory, because they assume, well, that's for peaceful purposes. If all you think about is the classic nuclear attack against a city or a military base by blasting it, you're looking for that other ballistic trajectory, not a satellite trajectory. So the idea was, put a nuclear weapon in a satellite, launch it on a satellite trajectory to the south, so it's also flying away from the United States, and then orbit it over the South Pole and come up on the other side of the Earth so that it approaches us from the south. Because we didn't during the Cold War, and even today, we still don't have ballistic missile early warning radars looking south. We don't have any national missile defenses to the south. We're basically blind to defenseless to the south and can't see anything coming from that direction. Then when this gets over the United States, you light it off so it does an EMP attack. In the Russian case, what they were mainly interested in was paralyzing our strategic forces and our strategic command and control and communications, so that we couldn't talk to our forces. Hopefully many of the forces themselves, the bombers, the ICBMs, the submarine support would be paralyzed. And that would give them time to then launch their massed attack across the North Pole to blow up our ice dam. So they kill them once with EMP and then kill them again by blasting the bases, by using their long-range missiles like the SS-18. That was the Russian plan, but the cutting edge of their plan, was this surprise EMP attack. And the North Korean satellites are doing exactly the same thing. Now the North Korea doesn't have enough missiles or sophisticated enough missiles to blow up our missile bases and bomber bases. We've dismantled so many of our bomber bases, it wouldn't be hard for them to develop that number. We used to have 50 strategic air command bomber bases. We've reduced those to 3. So even a little country like North Korea could actually eventually get the ability to take out our bomber wing. But what they seem to be doing with the satellites is the EMP part of it. And they don't seem to be as interested in, possibly it is also, you could use the EMP to attack our strategic forces too if they've got a super EMP warhead, which is what the Russians told us they were working on. It has field strengths that are so high that it could damage and destroy even our protected EMP systems. But I think what they're mainly going for is the unhardened electric grid, transportation, communications, and all the other civilian critical infrastructure that we depend upon to keep our population alive. And I think that they're positioning themselves as sort of a nuclear missile age, cyber age version of battleship diplomacy, in my view. So that they can constantly they're going to try to build a constellation of these satellites so that they can always have one of them very close to being over the United States or over the United States. And then if the crisis comes up and we decide we're going to attack North Korea, Kim Jong-un can threaten our president and say, don't do that, because we're going to burn your whole country down, which is basically what he said. I mean, he's made threats to turn the United States into ashes, and he's connected his satellite program to this actual in public statements to deter us from attacking. And the other possibility is, or in addition to that, if we don't listen to those threats, then by destroying our country, taking out our civilian critical infrastructures, our military can't operate independently of our civilian base, our civilian electric grid. All of the economy and transportation systems, all of these things are necessary to project and sustain our military force overseas. So if you wanted to win a new Korean War, that's one of the things you would certainly consider doing is taking out the United States homeland itself.
Wow. Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, Executive Director, Chief of Staff of the Congressional EMP Commission. Thank you so much for being here on Aaron Klein Investigative Radio.
Well, thank you so much for having me and becoming part of the solution by helping educate the public about the EMP threat the mainstream media never talks about.
Thank you. Up next, phone calls, unscreened. I see Jimmy in Brooklyn is here. We're going to get to him next, plus more unscreened phone calls. If you want to join in on the action, there are a few open call lines, very rare. 877-970-2999.
On top of that, at this point, after North Korea has done all that they've done, firing a missile over a Japanese island, and now we have shown them that we can take their missiles out of the sky, and the pledge by Kim Jong-un to keep doing this, it seems to me the next logical step for the United States is when he launches another missile, that we probably ought to be prepared to take that sucker out of the sky. Yeah, good idea or bad idea?
It's a necessary idea. I think we should actually dramatically enhance our anti-missile capabilities, and we should communicate publicly that only when missiles have been inspected will they be allowed to fly, and that any effort to fire a missile without inspection will kill the missile, starting with killing it on the launch pad. I mean, if you think about how these missiles work, the slowest and easiest point to kill it is the first 100,000 feet, because it's going straight up.
Agreed.
And so what you want to do is develop a combination of laser weapons and hypersonic weapons and set up a doctrine and be very clear about it. No, we don't trust you. No, we're not going to take any risk that you're going to take out an American city. We're not going to take a risk you're going to use an electromagnetic pulse attack on Tokyo or on Seoul. And so we're just serving notice that, we're not going to start a preemptive war. We're not going to try to knock off your regime. But unless you agree to have us inspect each missile before it is fired, we're just going to kill him and put him in a box. We have the technology.
I love the idea. I don't think we have any choice, and then it gets into bad choices upon bad choices. Because
what I don't want to do is either rely on some kind of real approach. If all we do is talk loud, we'll be like the presidents who have failed. On the other hand, I don't want us to talk ourselves into a box where we decide that we have to have
full-blown war.
Full-blown war, because as you and I have talked about before, there are so many thousand artillery pieces and missiles aimed directly at Seoul.
There's no good option. And
right.
And then if a war is going to start, it's going to be Kim Jong-un that starts it.
That's right.
And there's a part of me that believes he probably does want it, which is dangerous for everybody, because the net result of that is there's no good options. All right, stay right there. Number one best-selling author, Understanding Trump, Newt Gingrich is with us. We'll get to more of his insightful comments when we get back.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. By the way, just as a footnote in that discussion we were having about the confirmation hearings, and particularly the Delphi and Durban exchanges with Notre Dame law professor Amy Barrett, she's the mother of 7, too. She described herself as a faithful Catholic. She's living her faith, big family, successful, obviously Notre Dame law professor, nominee to the appellate court. This is everything that the feminist movement talks about with the kind of the woman who has it all and does it all, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet, did anybody come to her defense when she was being excoriated in a room temperature tone of voice, but excoriated nonetheless because she's a Catholic and she takes her faith seriously? No, they were silent because they're hypocrites and cowards. We're going to get back to that story. But for now, we need to go to threats abroad, and most notably the North Korean threat. And to help us explore what the president's options are at this juncture is our friend, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and AEI scholar, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So you said earlier this week the only diplomatic option left is regime change, essentially South Korea taking over the North. If that's a fair characterization of what you said, how could that actually be accomplished?
Well, what needs to be done is to convince China that reunification of the Korean Peninsula is in China's interest. China has the unique capability to apply unbelievable economic pressure against North Korea. If they were really serious in saying they didn't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, they would have done that sometime in the past 25 years. The reason China has not applied that economic pressure is that they fear, quite correctly, that it could bring the regime in North Korea crashing to the ground. And the result of that would be millions of Korean refugees fleeing into China, the intervention of South Korea and the United States to seize North Korea's nuclear weapons and try and restore order and prevent massive refugee flows into South Korea. It could bring Americans right to the Yalu River, right to the border with China. And they don't want to see that possibility. But the fact is that as long as North Korea continues to exist, its nuclear capability will continue to grow. And that means, from China's point of view, the risk that Japan could get nuclear weapons, South Korea, or others. So my pitch to China is not to try and apply pressure to them, although the threat of a Japanese nuclear capability is pretty powerful, but to say, if you're serious that you don't want to see North Korea with nuclear weapons and you don't want these other tragedies to befall, let's do this the easy way rather than the hard way. Now, people in the United States say, but China wants a buffer state between China proper and U.S. forces in South Korea. Look, I think Chinese strategists are way ahead of that. A couple hundred miles of terrain isn't a buffer in an age of intercontinental ballistic missiles. There's a way to resolve this problem. We have perilously little time to try and do it, which we'd started about 15 years ago, but I still think it's worth the effort, because once you get past that, there really isn't much other than the military option, unless you're content to have North Korea with nuclear weapons for all eternity and live under the continuing threat of nuclear extortion. And not just from North Korea, but from whomever they might sell these weapons to.
Right, and some are conceding that point, which I agree with you, should not be conceded. Gordon Chang, who's an academic in this space, has written a lot about China in particular, suggests that there are things that can be done still on the kind of economic front that would be debilitating to China, including a full UN embargo on North Korea, total UN embargo on North Korea, and essentially going after the Chinese banks so that we can't be pleading. Instead of pleading with the Chinese to intervene, we start to impose a cost on them for not intervening.
Yeah, well, this is a theory that's going the rounds these days, and let's consider what it means. It's an argument that we need to apply pain to China to get them to do the right thing on North Korea. Okay, I'm perfectly willing to entertain that. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. But in dealing with a huge economy like China, in order to do something more than just irritate them, you have to apply really sweeping sanctions. So let's say no involvement by Chinese financial institutions in the United States. That would be painful to China. It would also be painful to the United States. And the minute that was announced, the chairman of Goldman Sachs, the chairman of J.P. Morgan, the chairman of Morgan Stanley, the chairman of Citibank, the chairman of Wells Fargo would be on the phone to the president saying, what are you doing? The fact is, sanctions work, particularly against big economies, when you impose real pain and you are willing to bear the pain that your economy also suffers from cutting off economic interchange. Mm-hmm. Now, if anybody thinks the American business community is into pain, I'd like to have a word with them. So I just, as a theoretical possibility, sure, it might make sense. But imagine, suppose we said, all right, we're going to cut them off from cyber commerce, Amazon, Google, Facebook. They'd be all over Washington. The American business community, I think, is just not on board for this, which is why I think ultimately, while it might give us some comfort to apply a little pain to China, might make us feel good, what we really need to do is appeal to China's self-interest and say, look, coldly calculate what it means to you to have this rogue state developing deliverable nuclear weapons on your border compared to an alternative outcome that still leaves you secure, but which removes this threat from East Asia.
Well, what about Russia's idea to have a freeze for freeze? North Korea freeing their nuclear program where we freeze military exercises with the U.S. and South Korea.
Well, if you're on North Korea's side, it's a great idea. In the past 25 years, the North Koreans have multiple times promised to entirely give up their nuclear program, and they've lied about it every time. This is a society that's determined to have deliverable nuclear weapons, and there are really only, to me, two acceptable outcomes here. Either that regime disappears or their nuclear weapons disappear. If we end up, let's say, a year from now, with that regime still in power, still pursuing deliverable nuclear weapons, but which by then they may well be able to range all across the United States, we have lost.
I want to just switch gears and ask you about this piece that was written by Johns Hopkins professor Michael Vlahos about Sebastian Gorka and his departure as part of the Trump foreign policy team, if you will. And he in the piece, he's critical of Gorka in terms of his foreign policy chops, his understanding of Islam, and so forth. But that's not really the point. The interesting thing that he makes is about the courtier class that he essentially intimates runs the foreign policy establishment in D.C. Gorka's fail, writes the professor, is less about him than it's a reminder how the stiletto wielders, the little fingers, Game of Thrones reference from a Johns Hopkins professor is impressive, still rule America's imperial city, relentless empire notwithstanding. This awareness itself should be further reminder that no nation should carelessly entrust its welfare to such as these. He talks about kind of inside the foreign policy establishment elites, part of the royal court that is always part of the royal court regardless who the president is. And Gorka, who was supposed to be at minimum a signal to the America First perspective on geopolitical matters was a casualty to them, suggesting that their preeminence remains despite the change in power in the Oval Office.
Yeah, well, I think there is a foreign policy establishment in the United States, in Washington and New York and elsewhere, and it's the establishment that's got us into the desperate straits we're now in with countries like North Korea and Iran, that doesn't understand the strategic threat posed by China and the continuing strategic problems posed by Russia. This is the establishment is what comes up with the consensus. Well, it's the consensus view that we need to apply economic sanctions to North Korea, and that's all true. And it is like any establishment, deeply rooted in the bureaucracy, which has its own culture in Washington. It persists unless somebody demonstrates leadership to change its direction.
You do not take steps to lower your guard. Only the strongest sanctions will enable us to resolve this problem through diplomacy. We have kicked the can down the road long enough. There is no more road left.
Well, there's Nikki Haley, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, urging the strongest possible sanctions against North Korea. This after the regime tested its sixth and most powerful bomb to date. John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, fellow American Enterprise Institute, Fox News contributor, is not a believer in sanctions. Sir, good morning to you. We found he's got something in common with Vladimir Putin. He said this last night in Moscow: sanctions of any kind would now be useless and ineffective. You believe that? What do you do?
For two reasons. Number one, sanctioning the North Korean economy is a waste of time. It's not really an economy. It's a prison camp, and the leadership doesn't really care what the standard of living of the people is. We've tried that before. Even when it was one of the poorest countries in the world, it developed nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So that's why people say, well, let's sanction the countries that do business with North Korea, like China. And yet, for years, China has said it doesn't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but it has not applied its unique economic power. Why not? Because it fears that doing so would collapse the regime in North Korea, bring millions of refugees into China, and lead to U.S. and South Korean forces intervening and coming to the Yalu River.
Well, diplomatically speaking, take it a little higher. How do you think this administration is handling this so far?
Well, I think the making it clear that they don't see any point in negotiating with North Korea is an important step. And in fact, there's only one country worth negotiating here, with all due respect to Vladimir Putin. It's not Russia, it's China. And this is the pitch to make to China. You don't want the refugee flow. You don't want an uncontrolled American advance inside North Korea. Let's do this constructively, merge the two Koreas, and get rid of this nuclear threat. Now, it's a hard argument to make, and we don't have much time, which is why the president's rhetoric about the potential use of military force is serious. And I think that does make a difference. We are running out of time. Let's face it.
Okay, Steve Mnuchin said this on Fox News Sunday about trade with not just China, but everybody, with Chris Wallace.
We are going to work with our allies. We'll work with China, but people need to cut off North Korea economically. This is unacceptable behavior.
So the suggestion there is you end trade with China?
With China. Look, China is orders of magnitude far more important than everybody else who trades with North Korea. So you want to cut off Chinese relations with North Korea. You want to cut off Chinese banking in the United States. This is where I think we're at risk of overselling the effectiveness of sanctions. When the head of J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and Citibank and Wells Fargo call Steve Mnuchin and say, "What are you doing? You're hurting us." I'm afraid it'll have an effect. Sanctions can work if you're prepared to bear some pain yourself, and I'm not sure the United States is ready for that.
Wow, so this administration would not take that step then? You think?
I don't think it would work anyway. That's the real irony of it. We could impose massive sanctions on China, and I don't think it would move them. I think you've got to appeal to China's self-interest here, and so therefore threatening things I don't myself have support, like nuclear weapons for Japan, may help.
former ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, calls for military option on North Korea. He said that North Korea's success in ballistic missile weapon reflect the failure of the American policies for 25 years over the three administrations to deal with the realities that North Korea was determined to get deliverable nuclear weapons.
Look, their objective for 25 to 30 years has been to be able to hit the United States with nuclear weapons delivered by ballistic missile. And they have gotten very close. This launch is one more indication of how close they are. I don't think this is conjecture. I think this is something our military, the South Korean, Japanese officials now very concerned about. And I have to tell you, it reflects the failure of American policy for 25 years over three administrations to deal with the reality that North Korea was determined to get deliverable nuclear weapons, and we have failed to stop them.
So what do we do?
Well, I think first we learn the lesson that, the essence of statecraft is finding incipient threats and making sure they don't become real. We have failed here. Diplomatically, we have very limited options, I think. I've indicated before, I won't go into the details. I think we need to reunite the Korean Peninsula. I think that's the only real way. But as I think our military officials are increasingly saying, the military option now has to be looked at. And I understand the devastation this could bring to the Korean Peninsula. Nobody wants to be faced with this. But if the other option is dead American civilians killed by a nuclear weapon launched by a regime that's the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world, what's an American president supposed to do?
A war in the Korean Peninsula would be terrible. However, a nuclear weapon detonating in Los Angeles would be terrible. We are at a point in time where choices will have to be made one way or the other. None of these choices are particularly palatable.
The Chinese have been jiving us for 25 years. They say they don't want the North to have a nuclear weapon, but they haven't done what they have the unique capability of doing. That's why I think if we could start discussing reality instead of trying to change North Korean behavior, which isn't going to happen, but start discussing a controlled elimination of the North Korean regime, reunification of the South and the North, essentially under the South's control with China's help because of their controlling economic power. There's a way to resolve this, but we are running out of time, and this is not a Cassandra version of history. This is the reality. Those missiles are getting close to the capability of hitting the continental United States. And, there's some question about their guidance systems, but honestly, if the North Koreans aimed at Los Angeles and hit San Diego, would it make you feel better?
Time is running out, and the president must weigh the military option before Americans are killed by North Korea's ICBM.
Joining me now, a man who could be president of the United States, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and Fox News contributor, John Bolton is here. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
So how does the president prioritize these things, specifically with North Korea?
Well, I think this is extremely serious. Obviously, when you launch a missile and it overflies territory of a nation like Japan, it's pretty clear the missile could have landed on that territory, which would be an attack. I think this missile in particular was a way of telling us we could hit Guam if we wanted to. This missile has the range to do it, but we fired it in a different direction just to see what you do. And by the way, there's no indication any missile defense battery from Japan, South Korea, the United States attempted to engage this missile. The Japanese have said they didn't think it was going to hit land. That's a pretty lame excuse. So
should they have shot it down?
Absolutely. What worries me is maybe we collectively didn't have the capability to do it. While theater missile defenses in that region have been built up, let's face it, if a missile like that comes toward the United States, we are not as adequately defended as we could have been if Barack Obama hadn't disliked missile defense so much. So my point is, this launch does take us one step closer to a real reckoning, and there's no blinking at this reality anymore. It's not because of what Trump did, he inherited it, but let's not try and wish this one away.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what North Korea might do, because I don't think, and obviously you have much greater expertise in this area, but it doesn't seem as though they would just lob one missile. It seems like if they knew they were going down, they would throw out as many as they've got, which some experts say is up to 60 nuclear warheads. So if that happened, how would South Korea, Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and the western United States defend itself from what could be a barrage of missiles from North Korea?
Right. Well, let's take one step back, if we could, and say, why does North Korea want this capability to begin with? Some people say, well, it's just defensive. It's because North Korea fears that the United States is going to overthrow it, and so it's purely to protect the regime. That is absolutely not true. I mean, defense is a motive, no doubt about it. But that government in North Korea still thinks it can take over the rest of the Korean peninsula, and it would be the one government governing the whole of the Korean people. So if they get this capability, the first thing they're going to do with it is use it for extortion. Yeah. Saying, for example, to the United States, you remove all of your troops from South Korea and or Japan or Guam or Okinawa, or we will take out Los Angeles, San Francisco, fill in the blank. Yeah. So I don't think the first thing North Korea will do will be to launch the weapons, but there's a possibility of it. And that raises really the second point. Many people say, look, these people are not going to commit suicide. They're not crazy. I wouldn't say they're crazy either. I don't think you need a shrink in to tell us how the North Korean regime thinks. I think they're rational in their own bizarre little universe, but they're not rational in our terms. And the facile analogy, we just think like this is the Cold War with deterrence between us and the Soviet Union, yeah. I think would be a serious mistake.
And it seems as though we apply that methodology to almost every conflict, and it is certainly outdated, which makes it so difficult and alarming. I want to ask you quickly before we go, you wrote an op-ed for National Review saying that you can no longer get into the White House. Is that because you're a national security threat, or the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, is just cracking down and he's paranoid?
Well, I don't know if I can get into the White House or not, but I apparently can't see the president anymore. That's why I published this game plan to how to get out of the Iran nuclear deal. And there is, in my view, a close connection between Iran and North Korea, both in terms of substantive missile work and quite probably substantive nuclear work. And I think politically, how we handle one may determine how we handle the other, and may determine whether dozens of countries around the world conclude they too can get nuclear weapons.
All right. Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kennedy.
Good to see you.